Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the Texas Chain Saw Massacre from 1974. This is day 1 of 5 of my Halloween week of videos where I review a different horror movie from different decades, the 5 days leading up to Halloween. The Texas Chain Saw Massacre is a notorious and controversial horror movie. It's scary, it's spooky, it's apparently gory, and it feels unnerving. It doesn't feel like something good. It feels like something that is both badly made and precisely made at the same time. It feels unkempt and unreal and visceral and scary and unbelievable and shocking, and letting it kind of crawl up your skin like you feel uncomfortable and you want to get out and not experience this ever again. Which is partly what made this film incredibly influential and such a big deal both at the time and especially in the slasher genre, which would happen a lot later this same decade. The Texas Chain Saw Massacre came out at a time where it was a wholly kind of different thing and no one was exactly ready for it. From the idea that this maybe was based on a true story, it was based on Ed Gein, who was also the inspiration of Psycho and Silence of the Lambs. So although people have compared this film to Psycho, probably because they both came from the same fucked up serial killer. And it does sort of feel that way as this film starts off with these teens going on a road trip to find out about these grave robbers, which you kind of forget about if you've seen this film before, that the reason they're on the road trip, you kind of just think they're just driving or something. They don't talk about it, but they're trying to see if their grandfather's grave has been robbed and check out their grandparents' old house. And suddenly they end up getting kind of involved with Leatherface and his family, and not very many of them survive. I originally saw this, this was probably one of the first films I saw after my parents were like, well, you can see any film that's R-rated now, and of course this was high on that list. I knew it was almost rated X, but at the time I saw it in the 90s it was R. I remembered it being dirty and grimy and gritty and uncomfortable and all those things, and when I saw it this time it was not on a VHS at Blockbuster where the VHS of Blockbuster looked dirty and like it had been through a war, or the cover. The VHS played fine, but it was gritty. You saw that film grain. It felt like I was watching a snuff film. It felt like found footage, which this would definitely influence with the Blair Witch Project and many other things. And that's one of the truly unnerving things about this film, is it does feel like you kind of happened upon a really disturbing piece of cinema that you weren't supposed to see. It doesn't really say that in it, but it feels that way. I think a lot of this film is so implied and makes your mind go crazy, and that makes it so much scarier, because you do feel like while you're watching it, you're like, I shouldn't be here, I shouldn't be watching this. And not in that like bad movie way, which bad movies do that too, but in Texas Chain Saw Massacre you feel unnerved. You feel like you put yourself in a place of absolute horror. I mean, obviously Blair Witch took kind of the beginning and used that in their film with a lot of other influences, but I think when I first saw it, there was that grain, that film grain in it. It felt dirty. And when I saw there was a restored version on Amazon Prime, I was like, alright, I'll watch it. But I was at first unnerved when it first started, not just because of the movie and the opening shot and everything. I mean, that was disturbing also. But having it restored, I was worried like, man, maybe this film won't hold up without film grain. And how will this film change? And what does it say about this film that it needs that, in my mind? And while I was watching, I realized it doesn't need that, because the way the camera moves, the camera work by Daniel Pearl, who actually shot this film so uniquely. When they remade it, they were kind of forced to rehire him, which is interesting. He became a big cinematographer. He actually shot the music video for Every Breath You Take by The Police, believe it or not. The way he moves the camera, it feels very much like they had no money and didn't really know what to shoot, and combined it with stuff that they knew exactly what they were doing and exactly what the effect of the camera was having. And his cinematography is so perfect in this. It's like what him and Tobe Hooper did with the camera in this adds to that unnerving, creepy feeling. This felt as unnerving and scary, and still felt like a film you just shouldn't be watching without the film grain, which was shocking. And it says more about how well made this movie really is, that, you know, for I think a whole generation watched these shitty VHS tapes of this movie and it felt fine, but when they restored it, you realize the real genius that's at work with this film. Before, I don't think it highlights it as much, because you kind of expect the weird film grain, you expect the kind of dirtiness, but especially when she's screaming at the dinner table, which is just still an incredibly both hilarious and terrifying scene at the same time. The way the camera's moving around her, it's so inventive and smart, but also disturbing. I'd say, it's interesting to note that I always thought of this film as a gory film, and I think a lot of people do, but there's not a lot of gore. Tobe Hooper, believe it or not, this is true, actually thought he could get a PG for the Texas Chain Saw Massacre, which is an interesting thing that Tobe Hooper thought, and actually tried to work with the MPAA, and they were not having it. There are certain gory parts, but it's not really as gory and this huge splatter fest that I think you necessarily think, especially for a film that's, about a chainsaw massacre. You'd kind of assume that'd be a little gory, I think, and, naturally so. But in this film, a lot of it's implied, a lot of it you see off screen. I mean, there's the hook scene, which everyone talks about how it's one of the most violent scenes, but you don't see anything in that hook scene. You see her lifted up, you see her like that, you see her just go like that. I mean it was better than, she did a much better job acting than what I just did, but you don't see it go in, you don't see the gore of it, you don't see the blood as much, and that is how good this film is, because you didn't need it, but yet I had seen this before, and I had a lot of these images imprinted into my brain. Like, I haven't seen this film that many times, but I remember it very distinctly, and almost assumed it was gory, even though I don't have images in my mind of it being gory. But just the way it plays, you are like, this is gory, this is disturbing, this is gross, and yet it isn't. And I think, it is gross, and it is weird, and it does feel like you shouldn't be somewhere, but it's not gory. I find that incredibly interesting, and especially the way I think Gunnar Hansen plays Leatherface adds to that crazy quality, because you don't feel like he fully knows what he's doing. You feel like the whole family is very off. The way Gunnar Hansen plays Leatherface, and particularly how he researched kids with mental disabilities, and you could tell that throughout the film, and how he played it so well. Like, even how I read later that he's a much faster runner than the girl he was chasing, but he'd find random things to do to slow himself down, but it feels like he's kind of this manic, crazy, mentally disabled killer. Like, he will suddenly stop because that makes sense to him, and he plays it off so well. I actually, when I read that bit of trivia, I was like, oh my god, that works so well in his performance. Like, I think a lot of these guys who just put on a mask and are like, who are a Jason or a Leatherface or a Michael Myers, don't get enough credit for the pure physicality of their performances. And I think Gunnar Hansen did that. Obviously, it was before those guys, and I think he showed what you could eventually do, but he added a sense of humanity underneath that really makes it more terrifying. You usually think that these guys are kind of random killing machines, like Michael Myers in particular, and I think Gunnar Hansen's performance makes you think that maybe it's not so random, but you also are not sure if they entirely know what they're doing, and that terrifies you. I remember hearing a quote about Texas that a Texan's greatest fear is that they will get stopped on the side of the road and this will happen to them, and I think this film plays in that realism of it, especially because technology kind of ruined this kind of slaughterhouse town, and this is kind of what's left over, which makes it even more spooky. I like the little intro, which is actually narrated by John Larroquette, who actually was paid just a joint to do it, which is kind of funny. You don't realize it's John Larroquette because he's like not really doing a John Larroquette thing, he's just doing that creepy voiceover, but it's funny that a very influential voiceover was someone who would go on to do a completely different thing. A lot of what this film says about eating meat in America, and this was done in the post-Vietnam age, but also showing how violence was so entrenched in our culture, and Tobe Hooper, who became a vegetarian after making this film, so I guess that sort of explains what it's about. But I think it is more about how we accept violence in our society, and the idea that what violence accomplishes for us to live our certain lifestyles in our society, which was certainly something that Tobe Hooper was talking about in this film. And I think it both plays as a very scary, unnerving film of these people who they've suddenly been stuck with and have to survive. It works on that horror movie level very well, but underneath the surface, it's talking about the underneath the surface of our society, and particularly how we eat meat, and we're fine with cows and pigs being slaughtered and tortured and everything like that so we can feed on their flesh, and having these cannibals do it to human beings makes you realize what's going on to get us that meat. That's certainly something that I think makes you scared a little bit, because you suddenly like, oh, they're gonna treat me how they treat those things, and how forgotten that stuff is before it's chewed and eaten on like meat is. I think that shows that how terrible and scary of killers they are, but it does talk about how, particularly when people were just, this is a post-Vietnam film, and how the public was shown the footage from Vietnam quite frequently, and how, the gory dirty details of Vietnam. And I think a film like Texas Chainsaw is kind of confronting you with violence at a time where people were being confronted with violence and thinking about the costs of the society that they live in. Not that Vietnam was a war that really did that, but you know, the idea and metaphor still works. I know a lot of people have problems with the kids who are in this, or the teenagers, and you know, Sally, played by Marilyn Burns, is obviously, you know, kind of the main final girl, I guess you could say. She, I think, does do a pretty good performance, but particularly Franklin bothers the shit out of everyone. I'm fine with him. I mean, he's a bit much, I guess, but I always feel like you have to have someone in a horror movie, especially in a slasher kind of a film that you sort of don't like, so they could get killed. And I think he kind of fits that mold, so I'm fine with it. I like all the kids in it. They add a sense of normalcy, so when they pick up the hitchhiker and he's doing those things with his knife, it makes it extra disturbing because they're like normal people in society and he clearly is not. And I think they need something to play off of. What makes Leatherface and his family almost more terrifying is looking at these normal people in society and having that juxtaposition. Without that juxtaposition, it wouldn't be as terrifying. So I think they actually play a role in this. It's actually very smart. Most of the time when they have teenagers in a slasher film, it's like, oh, they're gonna get naked and have sex, and then the guy's gonna stab and stuff, and that's how it is. But in this, you need that person to play off of, so it highlights how crazy they are, but also shows how different they are, and that's really the point of those characters. Taking that away would be ruining an essential element to it. So when people complain about them, they don't understand narratively what it's really doing. I guess people now, I keep reading, they find this slow, they don't find it as exciting. I find this film such a crazy, thrilling but unnerving experience. I was watching this film, and the part where they're laughing at the dinner table, my wife, who was sleeping, woke up and was like, what the fuck are you watching? And this lady's like tied up to a chair with it. I mean, it was like out of context. That did not look good for me, frankly. I did have to pause it and watch it on a computer after that, like, just because it was so like visceral, like just like hearing it coming through the bedroom, I think was too much for some people. This is not a film for novice horror people. I think this is more from the experienced horror viewer, but I think that's what makes it so amazing and palpable and so influential, is that it has always felt like this dirty little movie and this murder that you shouldn't see. If there was, like, you know, more of a tape trading culture when this had come out, it came out in 1974 and was very successful, but I think it was successful because first you were telling people, oh, I'm going to see the Texas Chainsaw Massacre because I like fucked up shit, and just the name sounds cool, but then when you see the film, you're like, holy crap, this is like, this is some hardcore stuff. It feels like a hardcore misbegotten thing, and there's so many films that try to do that, and I can't think of one that sells it as well as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It makes you live in that, and it shows you that world. I mean, the things with Grandpa, the things with possibly they're barbecuing people, that, you know, that you have these cannibals who are, I think, probably grave robbing people as well, I'm not exactly sure, that you see their house and the conditions they live in, that you, when you first see Leatherface come out, this disturbing, weird, strange movie, it kind of came at the perfect time, because I think this film is perfect for 74 because it came right when Vietnam's getting towards its close. Then you had it be able to influence all of the slasher stuff and more of the serial killer films, and showing this disturbing, awful nature to it, this evil feeling that's going all throughout this film. I mean, it really does feel like there was some spell that this film wrapped within it, and that feeling goes throughout the entire fucking movie, and that spell can never escape. They can clean up the grain, they can clean up this movie, they can make it look professional, but it still has evil within its soul. And there's kind of an amazingness to what Tobe Hooper captured in this film. There's very few horror films that feel as unnatural and like maybe it should be burned and never shown to anyone, but you also feel like maybe we entrapped its evil soul in this, and we burn it, it'll let loose and destroy this world because this is unnatural and evil, the way Tobe Hooper did with this film. Tobe Hooper, this is probably one of the greatest cinematic achievements in horror cinema, and what he did with it. It is absolutely beautiful and wonderful what he did with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and it shows you why even people like Spielberg were interested in Tobe Hooper. It's almost like you want to scream at him, like, what did you do? What the fuck did you do? Like, how did you do this? How did you make a film that feels unnerving and unprofessional and like a shitty indie kind of slasher film, but also one that clearly knew how to use that technology to make the craziest, insane movie. Like, apparently they shot it, they were shooting for way too long, they were barely getting sleep, and it feels like that, but it also feels like they had comprehensive storyboards. It feels so well made and so happenstance. It is just the perfect example of a real entrepreneurial film kind of brat genius. Also feels like a mistake that God wished hadn't happened. And I think that's something that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre will never escape. It will always be this crazy little dirty old movie at this point. I think more people have probably seen it as a crazy older film that they're like, oh, I know this is a big horror movie, I'll check it out, and then have this whole like visceral, insane experience. Every time I've seen it afterwards, I feel like I really went through this dirty, crazy, visceral experience. I feel like I really do feel like wow, I need to take a break from watching movies. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a cinematic avenue to go in that you will never forget and remember for a long time. I've maybe seen this film 3 times, and I remember shots of it for all times, because it has that feeling that they're not supposed to go in there, that they will be slashed up, not by a knife, but by a fucking chainsaw. How dangerous that feels, and the dangerous hands that chainsaw is in. And I think that dangerous feeling is the kind of danger that Tobe Hooper brought to this film, and the danger he had in his hands and made into a crazy, insane horror movie that will keep infecting and scaring people for years to come, and still has that evil within itself that you kind of hope that no one will ever see and no one will ever know that you saw, but you also know that it was one hell of an amazing motion picture. And the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is one of those amazing horror cinematic achievements, with, even as disturbing as it feels, you know that it is a one-of-a-kind great masterpiece that can never really be outdone. So if you have seen the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And come back tomorrow for day 2 of the Halloween week of videos. I hope you enjoy these reviews and have a happy Halloween.